The Unreal Engine 5.7 preview just dropped a few days ago, and one of the most interesting features that they've been teasing for a while now is Nanite Foliage. Now, Nanite Foliage is a completely new way to look at rendering complex mesh geometry, and that's through a voxelized approach. They also treat all of these meshes as skeletal meshes, which is a bit of a departure from how traditional foliage is rendered. And I'll get into that a little bit later. Now, one of the big features that I'll be focusing on in this video is the Procedural Vegetation Editor. This is basically SpeedTree built right into the Unreal Engine editor, hopefully making it much easier to generate high quality foliage assets directly into your scene. Now, in this video, I'm going to walk you through how to use this vegetation tool editor, as well as my initial thoughts. And then right at the end, we're going to do a little performance test between the traditional approach to foliage, which is using alpha cards and some Quixel assets, and the new way to do it, using the Nanite voxelized foliage. So grab a coffee and let's get into it. So let's head over to our Epic Games launcher, and what we'll want to do is try to find the 5.7.0 preview. Now you can do that by going to your engine versions and hitting the plus sign, and then from the drop down, select 5.7. Now in my case, I already have it created, so it's not going to populate, but go ahead and download that. These preview versions are seen more as a sort of beta testing ground for users to catch bugs and offer any suggestions before the final actual version is released, which I'd probably estimate sometime mid next year. Once you're ready, simply hit launch and we'll create a blank template for us to work with. Alright, now that we have the project open, we'll want to do two things before we get started. First, we'll want to head over to the Edit tab, and then in the Plugins menu, we'll want to find the Procedural Vegetation Editor and enable that plugin. Now, before we restart, the second thing that we'll want to do is head over to the Edit tab again in the project settings, and then look for the Nanite Foliage checkbox, and let's enable that as true. And then now restart the editor to save your changes. Once the editor opens back up, the last bit of setup that we'll want to do is head over to our content browser, and then enable both the engine and plugin content. And this will populate a new folder on the left-hand side, which will contain all of the stuff that we'll be working with for the Procedural Vegetation Editor. So search up Procedural Vegetation in the search bar, and you'll see immediately that we have this level asset zoo that pops up. What we'll want to do is show in folder view so that we get the actual path for all of our procedural foliage, and then open up the level. Now, the first time opening it up, it did take a few minutes, so just be warned. Alright, so the map is finally loaded. So once you get in yourself, you'll see on the left-hand side we have a bunch of these PCG volumes that feature 4 different tree types, and as part of this iteration of the editor plugin, there's only 4 types of trees that are included. So on the left-hand side, you have these PCG volumes that are all full geometry tree assemblies, which we'll get into a little bit later as well. And the cool thing about these is that they're all skeletal meshes, meaning they use a different approach when it comes to things like wind. So the 4 tree assemblies that do come built in with this pack are all based from Quixel Megascan's assets. So these include the European Beech Pack, then you have Quaking Aspen, Norway Maple, and then a common hazel, which is more of a bush shrub type. Now, to do a quick little performance test, let's head over to our console commands and hit stat FPS. So you can see right off the bat I'm getting, 120 frames per second. And if I hit play, you can see that we're hovering around 100 frames per second, which is not bad at all. Now I will note that I have a 4080 GPU, but still the performance that I get from these trees is a significantly better experience than I've had with other foliage assets. Now this scene is a little bit sparse, and we'll do a little bit of a performance test towards the end of this video. But my initial thoughts, pretty impressed. The quality of the lighting and the shadows seems to be pretty consistent throughout, so that is pretty nice. Alright, let's head out of Play in Editor, and let's open up one of these tree assemblies just to see how it's actually put together. So as I mentioned before, these are skeletal meshes, meaning that they're made up of a series of bones that basically all connect to one another. And the bones allow for different types of simulations, with the biggest one being wind. Now, the cool thing about these assemblies is that because they're all procedurally generated, these assemblies are basically made up of anywhere from 8 to 16 or even more parts, meaning that these are just the same instances being repeated throughout the entire tree. What does that mean for performance? It means that these assets are pretty low cost to actually render in the scene, since the instances are already cached into memory. And that allows things like these trees, which are, anywhere from 20 to 40 million triangles, render without much of a hitch. Now, the second thing that they introduced as another optimization to add for these foliage assets is voxelization. Now, when I get really close to one of these full geometry trees, they get rendered as triangles, which is what we expect with traditional render pipelines. And the voxels aren't immediately noticeable. So what we can do is we can run a console command called r.nanite.viewMeshLODBias.offset, and the value is 0 by default, since it's always rendering the highest quality version of these foliage assets. So we can set that value to 3 to basically preview how the voxels are actually acting in the scene. And you can see as soon as I press enter, these background trees begin to look pixelated. And what these are essentially those voxels. So voxels are a different approach to rendering, where parts are broken down into cubes instead of triangles, as is traditional mesh. So they actually take up an entire pixel on your screen, meaning that anything behind the voxel won't be rendered. One of the biggest problems with traditional foliage in game engines is that these alpha cards often resulted in a lot of overdraw, meaning a lot of meshes were actually fighting to be rendered in the same pixel. And we can see, turning the overdraw on for these Nanite foliages, it's pretty good. And how do these voxels actually look in lit mode? So you can see that because my LOD bias is still pretty high, it's a little aggressive. And especially when you zoom out, it begins to look a little Minecrafty. But you can see as we zoom in and out, how the different LODs basically spawn in. And as I get right up close to a tree, how it reverts right back to triangle meshes to show what the actual geometry of that specific leaf looks like. Now, if you make the LOD bias 0 again, we can see that the LOD popping is not nearly as apparent as it was in that higher preview mode. And honestly, it's almost negligible. Like I personally can't decipher where these triangle meshes revert to voxels. All right, enough geeking out about the voxels. Let's actually look at how these assemblies are built. And all of these trees can be found under the plugins folder, Procedural Vegetation Editor, and Sample Assets. And now clicking one of them, so let's say the Norway maple, for example. You can see that it's broken down into skeletal meshes and the skeletons themselves. And then if I double click this Procedural Vegetation Editor, you can see that it opens up a graph that is pretty reminiscent of, the PCGs. And if you are familiar with PCGs, this will be something that is a little bit easier for you to pick up. Personally, I haven't had too much experience, and this is my first time deep diving into this, but even I found it pretty easy to customize what I was looking at. They have 4 trees set up that you can basically customize and export out as many as you would like. So I will focus on just the maple tree one, and let's break down exactly what's happening in the parameters. So the first parameter is carve. Essentially, this is sort of a trimming tool, allowing you to trim the radius, so it'll kind of create a little circle around the center of your tree and sort of control the spread of your branches. Then you have the length from root, which essentially controls the height of the tree. You can also do from the bottom, which controls the height of the trunk. And this gives you sort of more of that, shrub bush appearance. And then we'll move on to the next node, being gravity. So this is basically how much the tree is affected by sort of the weight of gravity. And you can mess around with these values for, an environment where there might be higher gravity, or let's say if you want to show something as windswept or dead trees, this could be a parameter to mess around with. And then they also have a phototropic variation of this node, which basically dictates how much the branches reach up into the sky towards the direction of the sun. And here we can play around with how much that's affecting it. Next, we have the scale, and this actually just controls the size of the tree trunk and its branches. And then finally, you can control how many branches there are by using a bunch of different variables. You can control it by light, by radius, by age, generation, a few others. So everything in that yellow group essentially controls the trunk and the branches. Then what we do is we create a mesh builder, which takes the foliage parts and spreads them across those splines that we created in that first few steps. To refine further, what we can do is head over to the bone reduction node. And what this does is that it allows us to sort of filter out the amount of bones that are existing in our tree. So for things like, the trunk, you might not want as many complex bones that could then be used for simulation. So being able to mess around with bone reduction, you can see that we can move it all the way to 0. And this is the output that the mesh builder gave us. And then if we go back to our default 0.5, you can see that we now have a little bit more of a simple version for our trunk and branches. Next, we can head over to our foliage palette. And what this does is it takes all those leaf assemblies, which have been pre-created for us, and spreads them along the branches as needed. Then for the foliage distributor itself, you can see that the first threshold actually controls the foliage distribution along all branches, and whether or not it should. The reduction always begins from the bottom up to the top, so this can be super helpful if you're creating a foliage scene, maybe in a dense forest, where a lot more of the brush would be towards the top of the trees, as the bottom branches wouldn't get as much light. And then you can also override a lot of the distribution settings. So you can see here we can control the instance spacing, so if we want a bit of a thicker brush, or we can turn that value back up to have a little bit more spacing between our leaves. You can then also control things like the base scale for the leaves themselves, and set minimum and maximum scale, so you get a little bit of variation in size for each of the leaves. So with that last change, I'm pretty happy with how this tree is looking, so we're ready to export. The first thing that we'll want to do is click the output node, and then in the export settings themselves, you can head over to the content browser folder. So basically just pick the place that you want to save it. For me, I just want to save it in my main content, not under the plugins file path. And we can keep the mesh name the same, export it as a skeletal mesh, and then we want to make sure that Nanite Foliage is selected to true, and then we're using voxelize to get the maximum amount of performance from this asset. And then you can see in the export settings, when you actually hit the export button, it lets you export up to 4 different trees. So you can actually configure 4 different variations of the same tree type, and then export them all in one go. In my case, I just want to export the maple tree number 1. So let's hit that and export. Now it'll actually take a few minutes to export out. And once we're done, we can head over to our content folder. And then we can see that we now have a skeleton mesh, as well as the skeleton of the tree that we just configured. And popping it into the scene, you can see how much bigger in scale it is from the rest of the foliage examples for Norway maple. So the next question becomes, how do we actually expose wind effects to this new tree that we made? And there was a really helpful video by another creator, Wise, that I'll link below. But here are the steps to get the global wind effects applying to our tree. Heading back to the Procedural Vegetation Editor folder, we can see under Samples, Materials, and Global Foliage Actors that there are 2 actors that we can actually use to apply wind to our new tree. So the first one, the Wind Transform Provider, is attached to our tree to actually apply the global effects. And then the BP Global Foliage Actor is how we can actually control the different parameters. So to begin with the Wind Transform Provider, the first thing that we'll want to do is create a new actor in our scene. Then we'll want to attach a instance skinned mesh. And then selecting the instance skinned mesh, we want to drag and drop our skeletal mesh for our tree into the appropriate slot. And then back on the Wind Transform Provider, we want to drag and drop that into the Transform Provider. Now you won't see anything right off the bat, so the next thing we'll want to do is actually add an instance of our tree to this actor. So now we can see our floating tree has wind applied. So let's drag that back down to the floor, and then we'll delete our old tree out of the scene. Finally, to actually control the wind effects and a couple other parameters, we can head over to this BP Global Foliage Actor. And you can see in the blueprint graph, we have a bunch of wind parameters, as well as season, health, and color variation. Now, you don't actually have to worry about editing anything within this blueprint graph, since what we can do is drag and drop this directly into our scene. Now, in this test level, you can see at the very top of our hierarchy, we have that global foliage actor already applied. So turning up the wind speed increases the amount of wind that is applied to our trees, and you can see that it also adds a little bit of a rolling action that's happening. Don't love that. So something that we can maybe look into fixing a little bit later. And on the back ones, it doesn't look as bad unless you get close. Okay, never mind. So that's an interesting one. But 15 seems like a good level where it still looks a little bit realistic. And then the next thing we can do is mess around with season strength. So the values really go from 0 to 10 here, and basically apply fall colors on all of your trees. And you can see that each of our trees, based on the type of tree it is, so Norway maple, beech, aspen, whatever, each have a color applied. And there's a little bit of color variation within each of these trees as well. So you get a pretty realistic looking forest if you were to spread out a variety of these trees across your scene. And bringing our season strength back down to 0, and then beginning to play around with health, basically makes your leaves a little bit more desaturated to make it look like the tree is dying. So one slider that I would want to add is to actually remove leaves. and that can really help us with a winter scene, where a lot of these deciduous trees lose their leaves. So with that, that was our Procedural Vegetation Editor overview. Now I'm going to jump into a quick performance test comparing how our old method of foliage using those Quixel assets might look in a forest scene versus the new ones. So here's how I'm going to set the levels up. First, I'm going to grab the European Beech Asset Pack from Quixel on Fab. Then I'm going to create 2 quick levels. So this is the one for the Quixel trees, just a flat plane with some basic lighting. And I'll add the static meshes for the Quixel trees to the scene. What I can then do in foliage mode is brush these trees on and create a densely packed forest scene. I'll then do the same for the new Nanite Foliage using the PCG volume that I just copied and pasted over from that test level. Alright, beginning with the Quixel trees level, let's go into our console log and enable stat FPS to see what kind of frames we're getting. And you can see we're hovering around 27-28 frames per second. And as I look up and down, you can see that the lighting and especially the shadows take a bit of time to recalculate. And that's sort of the dark spots that you see when you're looking up near the top of the scene. And then if I go into stat RHI, you can see that the triangles drawn in draw calls aren't actually that bad. You know, just around 14,000 and draw calls around 350. Which is pretty decent. It's important to note that these Quixel trees are also Nanite enabled. But the important difference is that they are not tree assemblies and they're not voxelized. And you can really see what kind of difference that makes, just in terms of the lighting and shadow quality. And the second biggest thing is that since they aren't skeletal meshes and instead static foliage actors, the way that wind is being applied is through shader logic. So a little bit of a difference from how the wind is being calculated via bones using the new skeletal mesh foliage. Alright, let's head over to the new tree assemblies that we've created. And go back into Plane Editor, and you can see right off the bat, as we're looking around, the quality of the lighting and the shadows are a lot better. Now, it does still take a second to recalculate, but for the most part, it doesn't artifact nearly as much as the old Quixel trees. And we can see that our frames are hovering anywhere from about 45 to 50, and you can see as we're moving around, maybe it drops down to about 42. So just under double the actual performance that I was getting with the other scene. And we can also see that this forest scene is actually a little bit thicker than the other one, which is even crazier that it's still able to produce a high fidelity scene where everything calculates relatively quick. And then the last thing we'll test is the Nanite overdraw. So again, overdraw is one of the notorious issues with foliage actors where many meshes are fighting to be rendered in the same pixel, which is not efficient at all. And we can see that that isn't really an issue here for the new Nanite Foliage. It's actually pretty crazy to see. So the last test we'll do is, for my channel and sort of the work that I do, it's more focused around ArcViz, where I'm not necessarily in the first person view at all times. I'm usually kind of in third person, circling around a building that is the focus of the project. So I have this ArcViz navigation template that I'm going to quickly add to the scene. And let's see what the performance is like there. So adding it to our scene with the new Nanite Foliage, you can see that it actually still, maintains that same amount of frame rate. We're still hovering around that 40 to 50 frames per second range. And for a dense forest scene like this, that's really good. Zooming out, you can see we're even getting upwards of 60 frames per second. And again, triangles drawn and draw calls still relatively low, sort of what we've come to expect with Nanite, so that's not that big of a deal. Now, replicating the exact same steps where we add our navigation template to the Quixel trees, you can see that the quality of the trees is a little bit less and the wind is a little bit less believable as well. But when you're far away, the frames still aren't too bad. We're around 40. But as soon as we get close in, it starts to dip below 30, which isn't optimal. Alright, so that has been the initial thoughts as well as a bit of a first deep dive into Nanite Foliage and the new Procedural Vegetation Editor. Honestly, I'm pretty impressed with how far this has come along just in a couple different versions. And I'm personally really excited to migrate my next ArcViz projects to 5.7 as soon as it becomes production ready. Now, I know that these Nanite Foliage feature is still experimental, but the performance gain that we're getting, hard to pass up. So, if you've made it this far and you've enjoyed the video, hit that like button and feel free to subscribe. to stay tuned for my next videos, which I'll be focusing a little bit more on that navigation template that I mentioned before, and how you can create your own for an ArcViz project. Until then, catch you on the next one. Peace.